The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. Today we're joined by Brian Herrera. He's an assistant professor of theater at Princeton University and the author of Latin Numbers, Plain Latino in 20th Century U.S. Popular Performance. He also hosts the Stinky Lulu Says podcast, where he offers insightful readings of contemporary theater productions. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is a theater history podcast, but this topic that we're going to talk about today, the history of Latinx casting, is a pretty contemporary one. It's been in the headlines a couple times this year. I wonder if you might explain some of the recent casting controversies involving Latinx roles, and also perhaps for anyone who might be curious, what we mean when we use the term Latinx.
Well, to start with the last part of that, Latinx is an emerging term, and a term that is relatively recently on the horizon. And what it attempts to do is deal with the complexity of language with regard to Latinas and Latinos. And also, as you just heard me mention there, we have the habit of talking about Latina, Latino, which sort of borrows upon the gender binary that is sort of part of the Spanish grammatic structure, right? And so if you've read anything about Latinos in the United, like anything from Latino studies, you've likely seen the Latina/O. You may have sometimes seen a version that came along in the 90s and into the 2000s, the Latinat, which was Latin with the and symbol, like the at symbol we would use on Twitter today. And both the at and the X are ways of which are attempts to sort of be gender inclusive within and beyond the gender binary. And so what Latinx has emerged is a way to think about Latino identity without over determining gender identity. So when we use Latinx, which is Latinx, when we use the word Latinx, it's a way to say a word very simply that is gender inclusive without imposing or presuming a gender binary. In my own vernacular, I tend to use the word Latino, and then I adopt other terms as I aim for precision and specificity. But we're in a process of discovery about what this new idiomatic turn is in terms of how do we talk about Latino communities, but then also how do we respond to this moment when across cultural groups we're thinking more precisely about gender diversity and gender inclusion and thinking within and beyond the gender binary in different ways. And so Latinx, just that very idea of how do we talk about Latinx casting, in some ways opens up the puzzle, because both Latino and gender are identities that are not always transparent on first sight. And so when we think about casting, which is often based in sort of a 20th century model, like if you had old school acting teachers that would say to somebody saying, you read like you could play Jewish, you read Jew, like this idea that somehow there's something about your features that match pre-existing impressions of what cultural groups or types are, that, oh, you might be 45, but you still read like an ingenue. These kinds of ideas of using exterior identities to map who we think the person actually is in some ways troubled by the term Latinx in all kinds of ways. Because Latinos in the United States, it's a complete cultural and racial cornucopia of options there. And in my own family, the span of skin tone ranges the full span of human skin tone. And so we can't always presume that when we're looking at somebody, we sort of can read them correctly if we're looking to sort of think about Latino-ness. And I think also we're seeing that more and more with gender, of just sort of asking the question of how we see them might not align with how they are presenting to the world or who they identify in the world. And so Latinx opens up these questions in particularly vivid ways. And we've seen, I think some of the controversies around Latino casting have, in some ways, that is the history of Latino casting, is the different moments of controversy. But most recently, we've seen it a lot with questions of how roles are cast in regional professional productions of In the Heights has come up a lot. Like there's a lot of controversy around a recent production that's in process in Chicago, a different kind of controversy with a production at Phoenix. In both cases, the lead character in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical In the Heights, which was his big Tony Award-winning Pulitzer Prize nominated musical before Hamilton, which specifically tells the story of a culturally diverse Latino community in New York City. And the central character is Usnavi, who is a Dominican American character. And in the Chicago production, it was cast with an Italian American actor. In this Phoenix production, it was cast with an Iranian American actor. And so these questions of what are the boundaries of Latino identity in terms of whiteness, in terms of being a person of color, in terms of these kinds of questions around when we're casting a Latino role, we are often doing kind of culturally analogous casting, where Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote the role of Usnavi, who played it on Broadway, is not Dominican; he is Puerto Rican. But they're both Latino. But both of those ethnicities are Latino. And so, in some ways, in our contemporary landscape, doing cross-cultural casting within the umbrella of Latino-ness is not an eyebrow raiser. But cross-cultural casting outside of the umbrella of Latino-ness does start raising eyebrows in different ways, especially as we move to questions of white privilege and the broader conversations that seem to percolate every month or so around whitewashing.
And you write some very interesting stuff in Latin Numbers, particularly about mid-20th century attitudes towards Latino, Latinx identities. But before we get to that, I thought I might ask you a little bit about casting, because you're working on this right now, and you say that casting's not something we think of as having a history. It's just this kind of mystical thing. You quote the producer Arthur Hornblow, who said of Marilyn Monroe, "As soon as we saw her, we knew she was the one." I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about the history of casting. What are some of the ways in which it starts to change in the mid-20th century? What are some of the ideals versus how it actually works in practice?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to go about this, and of course, I'm deep in the thick of this. So it's sort of like, how do I dig myself out of the pits I find myself in as I'm researching this book, which I'm proposing to write about the summary history of the material practices of casting as they emerged in the later 19th century and continue to evolve through the early 21st. And basically, my argument in that book is that casting, as we know it today, sort of really came to be in the United States, and in some ways, I think this is it starts as a very U.S. story. When sort of the railroad came along and theater became sort of nationally circulated in a different way. And it's in some ways the moment when industrial capitalism discovered performance as a profit-gathering commodity. And suddenly it wasn't troops as much as it was joint stock companies with lead actors and then hiring and jobbing other actors. And then when film comes along, and then when television comes along, and when radio comes along, we start seeing the ascendance of what is the 20th century model of the actor as freelancer, where the actor is not necessarily hired as part of a company the way most, or based on where they live, which is like, of course, actors have been assigned roles for millennia. But it's beginning in the 20th century, it's not rooted by troupe or by location or by family structure in the same ways as more and more as more and more industries become involved. And so part of what I see happening is we also see with the rise of film a real orientation toward a closer investment in having the actor match the part physically. And so what was the primary aesthetic in the 19th century, which was you would specialize in a type. You would specialize in certain kinds of roles that would be what you would be good at. And sometimes you would play those roles well beyond the age you were appropriate for them. Or you might play roles that had nothing to do with you racially or culturally, but it was because you could play that type, and that was what you were good at. Somewhere along the 20th century, we start becoming there is a turn toward what I would argue is sort of a move from sort of racial, like sort of mimicry, to homology, sort of a matching, like what I sometimes call like, there was in the 19th century, nobody expected the actor would match the character they played on stage. There was always an assumption, like that's why we can have somebody like Sarah Bernhardt play Hamlet, or like these older women like play the young girl in Uncle Tom's Cabin, all of these kind of things. There wasn't as much of an investment in what I would call the matchy-matchy aspect of casting, that I would see you on the street and I would know what part you were right for on the stage. And whether or not we can blame that entirely on film, I don't know, but there does become a greater attention with the rise of naturalism and the rise of an investment in different investments in psychological and other kinds of realism in relation to sort of emerging filmic technologies that lead to a different investment in having a closer proximity between the body of the actor and the body of the character. And but of course, because theater has always been about pretending to be somebody you're not, there are always these ways in which actors are prized for their capacity to reach beyond the skin in which they're born to perform other kinds of characters. But as the 20th century moves along, what we begin to see, and I think we can sort of really feel the pressures of this in different ways today, certain bodies are understood as being neutral and universal, of being able to play anything, and certain bodies, other bodies, are often perceived as being anchored within the type that they look like. And really it's like women over 40. Actors of color, disabled actors, whereas like a white guy actor can do all kinds of and that's sort of a confirmation of their artistry. The idea of, for example, Eddie Redmayne, who is an actor who for 2 years was Oscar nominated for roles. In 1 year he played a disabled character, and in 1 year he played a trans character. And in both of those, there's this idea that he is demonstrating his extraordinary versatility, his capacity to tell a universal story beyond the specifics of the person. Like, part of what is powerful about his gift as an artist in that moment is his capacity to reach beyond himself to tell a universal story. Often what we see with minority actors, women actors, disabled actors is the sense that their stories have to be specific in ways that align with their bodies. And this is what is the long arc of this tension between the pleasure in performance of seeing a performer who feels so real that it looks like that's exactly who they are, and the thrill of watching somebody become somebody else. This paradoxical pleasure ends up sort of aligning itself in peculiar ways with power. And certain bodies are authorized to play universal stories. Certain bodies are authorized to reach beyond the limits of their own body and play other kinds of roles. Whereas other bodies tend to be more rigidly tracked in only only being read for roles that match their exterior. And so this kind of tension is one of the tensions I think I'm interested in trying to chart. How did we get here, and what are the material practices that sometimes inadvertently support this this sort of rigid separation between who's universal and who's specific?
Yeah, and I was going to say, you talk at one point about this ideal that emerges of the so-called open market.
Yeah.
The idea that you hold the properly open audition, you'll find the right person who deserves to get that role. And you say in the post-war period, all of a sudden you get African-American performers from Latino and other ethnicities who are saying, wait a minute, this isn't working out. This is not nearly the equitable ideal that you're holding it up to be.
Well, and I think that paradox, that this idea that the article that you're referring to, I dig in a little bit deep on that paradox of this ideal of the best actor for the role, and the ways in which that's a fantasy as much as it is and ways that kind of perpetuates the problem as much as sort of finds it's our magic card out of it. If we found the best actors, so the process worked. But on the other hand, it's also this fantasy that the processes we have will deliver the best actor, is this paradox. And one of the because actors have organized around access to opportunity for at least going back to the 1940s. That minority actors and their allies within their unions have often advocated for basically saying, there's no reason to hire a white actor in blackface to play this part. We have plenty of union actors who are African American who would benefit from the opportunity to play a role. So stop with your bad, sloppy shorthand of racial mimicry. Hire an actual African American actor. This way we can give, and this idea that if you hire an actual African American actor in such a case, you might in some ways kill two birds with one stone. You'll create opportunity and you'll resist the bad habits of racial misrepresentation. So there becomes this sort of both and kind of approach that mode of advocacy affirms. And that's a mode of advocacy which continues to this day. That is one that we can arguably really start seeing organized in the 40s, though there are earlier in the 20s and 30s, certain actors are making this claim. But the unions in the unions in both stage and screen are doing this work in the 40s, and it's what leads to this various cycles of the broader, longer, incoherent tradition of non-traditional casting that all often advocates for create opportunities for minority actors, and it will help to address the misrepresentation problems. At the same time, there is this. One of the things that I think we are fascinated by the history of casting and why casting becomes such a flashpoint for controversy is it's one of the very few moments in the theatrical process or any creative process where we can actually see power's operation, because we can actually see the moment when resources are being allocated, when the choice to exclude a vast body of people in preference of one is also aligning with opportunities of resources, of finances, of visibility, of all of these things. So casting, and I think comparably, I would make the argument that one of the other places we see these controversies erupt is a comparable moment with season selection, which is again a moment when it's sort of there's a public acknowledgement of we have made a choice that excluded a whole raft of people. But because casting has that kind of power to both include or by its very nature, it is an exclusive gesture. It picks one person as opposed to all the other people who they could have picked. And that ends up bringing it a different kind of focus and attention, and makes it, as directors will often, like one of my favorite quotes in that article of the best actor for the role is the quote from Harold Clurman, which was talking about how the group was the group theater. They founded it with this idea of we're not going to have these open calls. We're not going to have this meat market approach to casting. We're going to cast from within it. There are going to be no small parts. There's going to be no star actors. And then very quickly, it just became, he said, every act of casting became a big tragedy in the company, because there is always a sense of exclusion that comes with casting. And so I think the fantasy of Best Actor helps to ratify our belief that we're doing the right thing, that the practices and techniques that we're using of like having open readings or having widely publicized auditions, or in equity situations having open equity calls, like this is letting us see as many people as possible. But deep down, the tradition of theater is very rarely an inclusive one. It's often based on choosing who you're going to work with for a period of time. So it's a paradox that is foundational, and yet in our contemporary United States moment, we have this fantasy that best actor, that if we hold up this ideal of best actor that we're looking for the best actor for the part, it helps to ratify what may have been inequities that have charted the process up till that moment.
And it's interesting, so many of the inequities, I think back to, the hashtag Oscars so white, have to do with, it seems, sort of African American versus white Caucasian. You talk about a term that you use, the stealth Latino, that points to this very kind of interesting place that Latinx performers have within American theater, within American film. There's this moment, particularly in the 1950s, that you talk about in your book, where it's not quite clear how they fit into that black-white dichotomy.
Well, and that's sort of why I was drawn to that chapter in the book, was the chapter I was really working to try to figure out to write, because I was fascinated being an Oscars geek, sort of connecting to Oscars So White. Being sort of an Oscars geek, I was fascinated by the fact that between 1947 and 1963, more Latino actors were nominated for and won Academy Awards than any period before or since. So let me say that again. 1947 to 1963 had more Latino Oscar nominees and wins than any period before or since. And when you think about that, we don't often think of the 1950s as the golden age of Latino cinema. So I wanted to sort of dig into that and look at who those actors were. These are actors like the nominees included people like Rita Moreno and also Anthony Quinn, Jose Ferrer, Susan Kohner, Katie Jurado, others. And I wanted to look into the fact that of those nominees, that can't just be that they were like the one, like I wanted to get a sense of what the ecosystem for Latino actors, or actors that we would today recognize as Latino, what it was for them. And I chose to chart three actors, Ricardo Montalban, Juano Hernandez, and Mel Ferrer, each of whom, because they Ricardo Montalban of Mexican descent, Juano Hernandez of Puerto Rican descent, Mel Ferrer of Cuban descent, these are the three core Latino demographics that had kind of fairly key demographic upheavals in the same period. And also, none of them became stars. All of them were always seriously working just below the level of A-list stars. And at the beginning of the 1950s, they were each was as Latino as the other. They talked about being Latino. They talked about being bilingual. They talked about their cultural background. Their names were not closeted. Their names actually announced their ethnicity, and they each were as Latino as the other. But at the end of the 1960s, or at the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, it was very clear that Ricardo Montalban was the Latino one. Juana Hernandez had become black, and Mel Ferrer had become white. And so I was sort of that's how they're remembered now. Like when we remember the three of them, the one that's remembered as an iconic Latino of mid-century is Ricardo Montalban, and Juana Hernandez is remembered as one of the most important pioneering African American film stars of the period, and Mel Ferrer is remembered primarily as Audrey Hepburn's husband, but also as he's not remembered as a Latino. And all of them were avowedly, openly Latino the whole time. So I was really interested in what was the climate, and it was during this period where all three of them, given what I've described about them each of. All of them played Asian, all of them played Native American, all of them played Black, all of them played Latin American, all of them played European, all of them played South Pacific. There was a period in the middle 1950s when Latinos, it wasn't clear what they were. They were exotic, and that meant in some ways that they ended up playing all kinds of different kinds of roles, often at the borderlands of ethnicity. And so what I was attempting to do was, in that chapter, was to look at how casting practices can help to, in retrospect, help document the limits of racial legibility in a particular moment. And we don't have to know why they got the part. We can take for granted the fact that they got the part, that it wasn't a deal breaker, that it wasn't a deal breaker to have them in this part, even though we look at it now and we see Ricardo Montalban playing in Yellowface, playing a kabuki master in a very serious Oscar prestige film in which Asian Americans are nominated for Oscars in the same film that he plays a kabuki master. We can see that there's something like that was clearly, it occasioned some comments in the moment, but it clearly wasn't a deal breaker either. So how do we get back to that moment as being sort of what's going on there? Why Ricardo Montalban? What's going on? What's valuable about a brown body like his in that role? What's useful about that? Which ways is Ricardo Montalban legible as white and as black simultaneously, a way that creates a sort of an ethnic borderlands? And so that's why I was very interested in the 1950s, in a period which I would say was a period when the actors we would today recognize as Latino became sort of all-purpose ethnics. They could play all kinds of different things, but this was also a period where it wasn't entirely clear whether Latinos were non-white or whether they were, in the conversation about Puerto Ricans in the same period, in the newspapers of New York, describing like what was the panic about Puerto Ricans arriving in the 1940s and 1950s. Some of them were really asking, are these folks like the latest wave in the great immigrant tradition? Is this sort of like 50 years ago, it was Jews and Italians arriving in Ellis Island. Now it's Puerto Ricans arriving in a different channel. Other folks were thinking it felt much more like the Great Migration of the 1930s, of brown folks coming from the South who already were U.S. citizens. And so there was real uncertainty where they fit in this white-black binary. By the end of the 1950s and entering into the 1960s, we begin to see the codification of what comes to be named Hispanic or Latino as an aggregate ethno-racial category, which will collect these groups, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans, as a sort of not exactly white, but definitely not black, separate ethno-racial category, which is named by the Nixon administration in the 1970s as Hispanic, and which then is variously self-determined as Chicano or Puerto Rican, and then ultimately Latino as a self-determination in sort of resistance to the sort of the more colonial or imperial notion of Hispanic. But that's a process that I think was in active formation in the 1950s, and I thought that one of the best documentations of how unsettled the question of race with regard to Latino was if we looked at the documentation provided by how Latino actors were used in stories about race and ethnicity. And so there's ways in which casting can help us see things about our society that we don't even have words for at the time.
I'm particularly struck by two stage plays that you talk a little bit about their production history. Ricardo Montalban is in a play called Jamaica with Lena Horne. Mm-hmm. Very important play, particularly for African-American performers, mid-20th century. I wonder if you might talk about that, and then we can talk about Strange Fruit after that.
Well, Strange Fruit is before that, so it's 10 years before. So just for chronology's sake for the audience, Jamaica was a musical that was designed to sort of capitalize on. It was designed initially as a vehicle for Harry Belafonte, and it was designed as a calypso musical, and set in Jamaica in the Caribbean, and it ended up losing Harry Belafonte because his film career was just too big, and so they repurposed it for the female lead, and they built it around Lena Horne, and it became Lena Horne's first big Broadway presence. They amplified her sound, like all these. It was a key musical in terms of sound application. All of this. It was widely understood to be a black cast musical. And the black cast musical, what's notable about it is the male romantic lead was played by Ricardo Montalban. And so even though the musical is often referred to as all black, Ricardo Montalban, when he writes about it, he doesn't identify as black. He even identifies more as white, but he also identifies with a sense of racial sort of solidarity at the same time because they got a lot of hate mail because it was romance and all of this kind of stuff. And so this same period, like what I love is like Jamaica's playing and he's playing black, and then the same time Sayonara opens around the corner and he's playing Asian. And meanwhile, he's the most famous Mexican-American actor of the moment. And it's this peculiar question of where does he fit? And the musical, in the moment in 1957, it opened the same year that West Side Story did and the same year that Music Man did. And at the end of the season, in June, when commentators were contemplating like sort of what was important about the musical, what was important about the season that year, one of those three musicals was identified as entering the canon. One of them was perceived to be so successful and so delightful that it would enter the repertoire and be staged forever. And then one of those three musicals was perceived as being entering the sort of the archive, the dustbin of history. And of course, just showing the distance of the recent past, the one that was perceived as being a masterpiece for all the ages was Music Man. The one that was perceived as entering the repertoire to delight millions for generations to come was Jamaica. And the one that was perceived to enter the dustbin of history as a noble experiment that was an interesting idea but didn't really work was considered to be West Side Story. So at the end of its first 6 months of run on Broadway, West Side Story was considered to be a sort of an interesting move, but not necessarily an important musical. And Jamaica, because of its popular songs, because it had done very well at the box office, because of all of those things, it was considered to be a sort of a musical that would have a life and would have legs. It ended up not having legs. It didn't really withstand. It couldn't survive without a major star in the role, without Lena Horne, and then ultimately Ricardo Montalban took the heat for closing the show when he decided to leave and not renew his contract because his family was still in California. But it was definitely an interesting moment in terms of what of the way in which race was seen and not seen when Latino bodies were in the mix. Because I think what's important to sort of take away from Ricardo Montalban in Jamaica is not questions of authenticity or inauthenticity, but really the question of what plausibility of was it plausible that Ricardo Montalban was non-white. And that's what it needed to be in the context of Jamaica. But and the same thing, was it plausible that he was non-white when he was in Sayonara? In other pieces, there were times where it was plausible that he was white when he was starring opposite Esther Williams in romantic comedies from MGM. These questions of the plausibility of whiteness and non-whiteness circulated around certain Latino bodies in ways that were very unsettled and could be very deployed in very different registers, depending on the narrative using them. And that's, I think, one of the important things about race and casting is race is an act of interpretation. Casting is always an act of interpretation. And often when we talk about race and casting, we're talking about what does it mean to cast this body in this role and what does it say about the meaning of race in this context? Because we often, in our academic world in particular, we talk a lot about interpretation. And how casting as an act, if we imagine this part with this kind of person in the part, this is what it means. But it is always also an allocation of resources. It is always to say, like, okay, this will work. Okay, a group of people sitting behind a table saying, we've got to do a show in 5 weeks. Who are the people that we can do it? We got to have a certain box office. Like it's often very sort of practical and mercenary, and often not thinking about societal concerns. And so there's those paradoxes of it is an act of interpretation and expression, and it as a material practice that is rooted in all kinds of other of the exigencies of performance making. I always want to try to keep in tension and keep in conversation together, because I think our conversations about race will often lead us to it's easier for us to talk more hypothetically about interpretation than it is to talk about the material operations of what are the other factors that go into how resources are allocated in a performance making context.
I wonder if you might have some thoughts about, given the history, and I mentioned briefly Strange Fruit,
Mm-hmm.
which, as you said, comes before Jamaica, but also kind of garners some controversy. You have Mel Ferrer, who is playing a character in an interracial romance, garners quite a lot of controversy. I wonder, linking the controversies of the 1940s, the 1950s, to some of the more recent ones around In the Heights, perhaps to some degree over casting requirements for Hamilton. What do you see emerging today in terms of strategies for casting? I think you've talked elsewhere on your podcast about coalitional casting.
Well, I've talked a little bit. That's an idea that Patricia Ibarra has introduced. This idea of, in certain contexts, like what I've talked about, the culturally analogous casting with Latinos in Latino casting and in Asian American casting, and even in African American casting, there has been a sense of a coalitional purpose of, just like if you're a Filipino American, you're playing a Japanese character, often that will mean that you sort of do this additional dramaturgical work to try to be responsible. There's a sense often that minority actors have a sense of the burden of representation, have a sense of why it's important to try to get it right, have enough of a cultural awareness to say, this is what's different from what I already know. I need to go talk to more people and learn more. So coalitional is a tactic about being mindful of the limitations and not only going with, I'm an actor, I can be anybody. Coalitional takes this idea of strategic, mindful strategy and of mindful allyship, and of trying to be a sort of a worthy partner. If you are the person that can play this part in this show right now, how can you do that the most responsible way possible? And I think what Mel Ferrer and he was not related to Jose Ferrer, but they both went to Princeton, which is sort of a funny thing for me, they were both very much rooted on sort of I guess we would say the left of the 1940s, especially in terms of racial politics. They were very much about, Mel Ferrer was very deft in his publicity. His major film breakthrough role was in a film called Lost Boundaries, in which he played an African American doctor who passed for years in a town in New Hampshire. And there was a lot of sort of very lurid speculation about Mel Ferrer and his plausibility in the part, and he was always very deft about saying, like, I'm sure I have African American. I'm sure I have African ancestry. I'm from Cuba. I'm sure I do. He was very much aware of playing that kind of troubling the color line, because I think part of what really connects the struggles of the 1950s, which were when Mel Ferrer played the white guy in the stage adaptation of the sensational interracial romance novel Strange Fruit, when he played the white guy dating a black girl in Strange Fruit, he took a similar tactic as he did when he played the black guy passing for white, which is like saying the color line is ridiculous. This idea of getting all hopped up about there being no crossing the color line is something that a Latino body reveals the lie of just by existing, typically. And so part of what we see, though, is even though we live in an increasingly multiracial culture where almost everybody's family has somebody who is biracial in it at this point, or somebody, if they're not your family, then your community does. It's hard not to. And those of us teaching college, we realize that so many of our students identify multiply. There still is a stubborn investment in this idea of there being a color line. And I think in some ways what we've seen now in the controversies with Hamilton, and indeed with the controversies that spun in the spring of 2016 around Hamilton's circulation of a casting notice as seeking non-white actors, which a New York TV affiliate decided to say, is that okay? And they spun this controversy basically they conjured a controversy out of nothing, and then causing the producers to say, we want to see everybody, but we're prioritizing. They had to sort of be more precise in the way they were going to do what they were going to do, which is in some ways, that's the lie of casting. Everybody is doing what they're going to do. They just use the right language to say what they're going to say, get what they want. But all of this is about this question of the endurance of the 19th century white-black color line. And it's the different ways that that color line still charts the world, even though the world is so not nameable by it. And so I think that what we see with Hamilton, with this notion, and I've just been working on some work around this idea of what Hamilton is premised upon is this idea that non-whiteness can be universal. This idea of sort of flipping the script in some ways, instead of having it be that we'll have white actors tell a universal story. What happens when we have non-white actors and their casting notices? And especially in 2015 when they announced a Broadway transfer, did that in a really interesting Miranda way of a mashup. And in this case, I think what Hamilton pressures us on, it's really going to push us in certain ways to parse through the 50-year tradition of the rhetoric of non-traditional casting, of how much the rhetoric of non-traditional casting, as we've been working with it for the last 50 years, has often relied upon the presumed authenticity that a body of color brings to interpretation, or the difference that a body of color brings. And I think what we're encountering is the limits of that. The fact that we still encounter the techniques of non-traditional casting with folks offering them as though it's a radical intervention, when in fact it's been part of the repertoire for easily 50 years, 60 years, if we want to be more precise. So what is the ways in which those ideas of how black and brown bodies and other bodies of color are useful on a stage? What are the ways that we can break out of some of the strictures? And I think Hamilton, in Miranda's very sort of specific way, I mean, I think that Miranda's a genius at working within the conventions of his moment. He's not a radical, but he's really good at bending the rules he has to do things that they wouldn't expect to have done with them. And so I think what we see in Hamilton, and I think as Hamilton continues to have a life beyond Broadway, especially in 5 or 10 years when it goes to schools and schools are doing it, or as we start seeing show choirs do Hamilton, I think we'll begin to see a little bit of what is the provocation that Hamilton has presented to the endurance of this white-black color line. It continues to find how race is understood in the United States. And I think that Latinx folks, as well as Asian Americans, African Americans, and Middle Eastern folks, but Latinx folks in particular, it's an ethno-racial category that is defined by racial hybridity. And so it is the ethno-racial category that is the color line cuts right through every Latino body. And so whiteness and blackness are part of every Latino body, as well as indigenousness, as well as Asianness, as well as all these other things. And so I think that often we see Latino bodies being of a different kind of interest in moments when the boundaries of whiteness are being defined. Because in some ways, that's what I feel we're seeing now, is there's more and more concern about whiteness becoming a minority, like not more than 50%. You know, this kind of these questions. I think the boundaries of whiteness are something that whenever we see a controversy like the one that spun around Hamilton, around is it okay for this to only have non-whites? Is this reverse discrimination? Is this racist against whites? Some of those things are I think are also asking questions of what is whiteness now, as we don't have something that's clear as a white versus black. Like, what is whiteness? And Latino bodies are often especially valuable when the boundaries of ethnicity are in question in society. We often see Latino actors being brought in to sort of inhabit that uncertainty, as we did in the 1950s. We also saw it in the early first decade of this century, when Latino actors were often playing Arabs and all those kind of things. It's like this moment of when we're uncertain what the boundaries of race are, Latino actors are often the first one that the industry calls to help solve that problem.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see how this develops in the coming years and decades. I'm going to post a couple of links in the show notes to your essay, Brian, on the best actor for the role.
Thank you.
We'll also have some information about Latin Numbers, your book. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, great. Thanks so much, and thanks for making this podcast happen. It's very exciting.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.